Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're making very good progress today. So this is our 5th roundtable of 7 this morning. We are packing the content into here, the Teatro Goya, the main stage. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next roundtable. It's called Digital Transformation in Sports. Nuestra próxima mesa se llama La Revolución Digital en el Deporte. Bueno, a muchos no nos gusta el cambio. Pero la única cosa innegable del cambio es que es inevitable y constante. Entonces, en lugar de resistirse al cambio, es mejor adaptarse a él o aún provocarlo nosotros mismos. Y digitalmente, eso ha estado ocurriendo por años, a medida que los deportes y, en efecto, el fútbol, van cambiando y revolucionándose. People are often resistant to change. The one thing about change is that it is, 1, inevitable, and 2, constant. And more important and smarter than resisting the change is adapting to the change or even provoking it yourself. This has been happening digitally for years. Those folk know what they are doing. Sport and indeed football are being transformed and disrupted. So this is the subject of this next round table. Presentamos entonces a nuestros ponentes y empezamos con el moderador. We're going to start introducing now our guests, particularly with our moderator, a man who I've worked with a number of times and who's become a friend in the industry as well as a colleague. Richard Ayers, CEO of 7 Leagues, and alongside him, please welcome Luis Vicente, Chief Digital Transformation and Innovation Officer at FIFA, Rusell Stopford, Chief Digital Officer at PSG, Jenna Pelkey, Head of Digital Content and Engagement at the International Olympic Committee, and Pedro, Presa, co-founder of MyCujoo. Please give them all a very warm round of applause. I love it. Richard, you are already disrupting. Wow. Look at you.
All right, I'll sit down.
You're fight ready. Forget AJ. Richard, thank you very much indeed. Great to see you again. Great to see you all. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will stand up if that's all right, because I feel like then it makes me much more part of you asking them questions, because this is about listening to 4 fantastic panelists. So just to introduce myself, I'm Richard Ayers from a company called 7 League. We work with probably 50% of our clients are football, and the rest are in all sorts of other sports. And we recently became part of the Mailman Group, which was an interesting moment. We'll see what happens there. So we have an excellent panel. You know their official titles, because you can read it in the book. But what we have is a man who is football through and through, who has seen a way to go in a new direction, and really sort of drive change. We've got a man who I described as one of the original, it's a terrible word, createch. Somebody who comes from a creative background but has an innate understanding of the technology. We've got a lady who has actually only been in sport for 3 months, but actually has digital transformation through and through in big, big American companies. And we have one of the disruptors, an agent of change. MyCujoo, one of those, a streaming platform which is there just like poking a stick, changing stuff. So a fantastic panel. We're not going to have time to be able to do questions, I don't think, because we've only got really 30 minutes or so. And this is such a big topic. There are so many things we could be talking about. So what we're going to try and do is kind of go some of the basics, just to establish that over the top, and then maybe get into some deep dive, because this is a high caliber audience. You guys know a lot of this territory, so we're going to sort of really try and dig in. If I may start you off, let's do some basic stuff first of all. Digital transformation, is it a thing? Isn't it just like the natural process of organic change in environments? Isn't that what happens, or does it? I mean, you're chief global. I'm going to add in loads of words. You've got the longest job title, right? Chief Digital Transformation and Innovation Officer. Yeah. Okay, so let's start you off. Luis, digital transformation, is it a thing?
Of course it's a thing. I think the main issue has not been a thing in sports. And I think this comes from some reasons or some fundamental problems that I've been raising probably over the last 5-6 years. Comes actually from the fact that on one side, we've always been very comfortable, in our business, in a certain state of laziness, which is not good in the current environment. I think second, we always felt that our business was very robust and was actually probably 100% was actually achieved. I think probably today I will say that we are 25 to 35% of the real potential of the football industry, so there's still a lot more to come. Doesn't look like, but it will. So basically, again, there is not too much rocket science on this, right? So it's not as difficult as it looks. Basically, is to bring a lot of very important examples that are actually happening around us, understanding that actually football and sports are part of a much bigger industry, are part of the media entertainment. We are fighting for time. We are fighting for attention, like many other businesses. And those businesses brought probably a maturity and also are forcing us, right, to do digital transformation. I'll say that probably, the businesses that are really forcing digital transformation in sports are not in sports. They are probably Facebook, they are probably Amazon, and a few others. And really, as well, the rationale of all this new initiative at FIFA, which is a very brave one, in terms of really once and for all make sure that not just FIFA, but the entire football ecosystem and potentially as well all the sports ecosystem will one day be able to start, execute, and conclude its own digital transformation process.
Okay, so there is a process. Rusell, where do you stand on that process element? You're Chief Digital Officer, and that has a very broad remit. Does PSG need transformation? Did it consciously decide it needed it?
I think, if I can just go back to what you said, is it a thing? I think, first of all, digital transformation, I think, is just, it's part of what happens when you have, a 20-year communications revolution, the way that people engage with content. Inevitably, it's a thing because, businesses were not built for the way that digital content is consumed and distributed and monetized in the way that it is now. So yes, of course it's a thing, but I think it's been a thing for, well, we've been talking about it, you and I have been talking about it for 10 years. So, I mean, the first digital transformation project, the first change management project around digital that I did was at The Guardian, where we were looking at transforming how they did, written journalistic content and moved into video and digital video. And that was probably the first time that we talked about transformation around digital. But I think at PSG, because this journey isn't finished, so it is inevitably a change and a digital transformation that is ongoing. It's not a fixed target. You can't say, okay, when we've done this, then we'll have finished our digital transformation, because it's an ongoing process. So it needs to be part of a club. It needs to be part of PSG. It needs to be part of all clubs and federations and other businesses, because the users are moving into completely new types of consuming content.
Okay, so Jenna, I introduced you as long history in digital, and he was the agent of change. But actually, are you in the IOC? Are you an agent of change? Is that part of your role?
I think to a certain extent, yes. And to a certain extent, it's about how do you help continue growing incredibly valuable properties and places and organizations. I think the world has given equity to sport and to the time they want to invest in and build a relationship with teams and moments and times and big events. And so I sort of look at myself as somebody who's taking that equity and figuring out new ways of bringing it to the world, of giving people opportunity to express, experience, and participate in it. So some ways changes, maybe. In many ways, it's about building on what's already there and just helping it continue to grow.
Okay. And when you were looking in your former life, in sort of corporate world, what were the sort of key tenets of the point at which an organization realizes it needs change? Does it need change? I mean, when do you know?
Yeah, it's such an interesting one. How do you realize you need something? Is, I think, a sort of an existential question we all struggle with. I think it's sort of that moment when you realize change is happening and there's an inevitability to what you were saying for PSG, and whether or not you're in a position to make a choice to choose it. Because it isn't just, digital transformation isn't just a series of technological choices or handle choices and structures. It really is a commitment to end say, we are going to change the way that we show up in the world. We are going to change the way that we connect through this medium. And it largely dictates what's happening. It's not your choices, it's users, it's platforms, it's how quickly it progresses and you can get ahead of it that make the decisions for you. And that's a big shift for an organization to say, I'm not going to definitively start and stop a project. I'm going to choose to be an inevitable change. That's hard. So I don't know that an organization chooses it. They may realize it at some point. I don't know that they always believe they need it, but they decide that it's an imperative to success.
Okay, so that organizational change must be driven internally. I mean, when you were in GE, is it driven from the top? Is there a structural shift? Or is it feeding back to clients? Or what was it that made the difference internally?
Yeah, pressures come, I think, from all different directions. Some of it is instigated from inside, from maybe your middle or lower levels of an organization who say, this is a new platform, we need to be on it, we don't know what this means to us, we need to figure out who are we on this, and they innovate. And so you look at organizations a lot of times starting to see the opportunity for change through little points of innovation that instigate change and start to create value. I like to say it wins hearts. You know, the digital transformation world, I think, lives in two places. One is winning hearts in the short term and building equity and value and getting people to believe in it. And then in the long term, very much about winning minds and helping them see and understand and feel the impact, whether that's a bottom line, it's engagement, it's reach, you know, any number of metrics that you can put against it. So I think it starts a lot of times in those little sort of niche spaces and starts to bring those values up and bubble up and up and up, but it doesn't go anywhere until you have top-down alignment on it. It is very hard to scale without that.
Okay, so Pedro, you've seen, MyCujoo's worked across a very wide range of associations around the world, done a lot in Asia, I think, as well. So do you find yourself looking at different football associations and saying, okay, these guys are going to move fast, because I can tell, you know, but these guys are going to be super slow, and you make decisions about who in the ecosystem is ready for change?
Actually, when we entered into the market, we started working with clubs, but then we understood rapidly that working with federations would create a bigger impact. And we don't go to the federation selecting them for a number of factors. It's the other way around. We present ourselves in a general context, and then the federations themselves apply to this change. And we're speaking about a very traditional business, which is broadcasting and streaming, and there's a lot of things involved. So the fact that these organizations are themselves moving forward and putting themselves towards this next step, it really shows that the football world is changing, basically.
Yeah. So in my background, when we were in news, this is 20 years ago, but you know, Google changed the way news worked, online changed the way news had to adapt. It took a long time. Then music got hit, and they tried to fight back, and it didn't work. And Steve Jobs, like every sector, they've made a difference. Russell, I'm interested. Do you think it's the technology that triggers that change, or what?
No, because I think the technology has been there for all of the industries to be able to use at the same time. Technology is democratic in terms of its its availability to businesses to be able to adopt it. I think what's different is the user behavior. That's what drives it. That's what drove the change in music. It was the fact that Napster was not going to die because the users wanted it. So other services came to deliver that. So I think what happens is probably you probably get elements of products changing and experiences changing within different businesses. So if you look at football, we have big audiences on our owned and operated properties like our website on our app, and then it's inevitably you have this huge growth of content that grows in social channels. So we take that on board because we can see that our users are there, so we focus more resources on that. So I think that's how it happens. It's really user led, and I think you have to use that data that you can see coming in, and then you have to adapt, and you have to look at how that's going to evolve and make projections about how you think that's going to change. But it's I think because the technology is moving, I think what you said about the fact that there's it's a very complex ecosystem with the different platforms and the different ways that content is available to different audiences. I think unless you adapt and you move very fast, you miss that opportunity. So
yeah. Well, so Luis, the technology is part of that change, but it's not entirely driving it. And you've been working long enough in football to know the ecosystem, or as completely shamelessly to use Jenna's line, the ego system inside sport as a whole, but for football in particular. How do you drive that change inside an organization like FIFA? I mean, it's a big beast.
Look, I think it's never easy, and as I say, I think it was a brave decision for organization as such to actually believe in the power of digital transformation and basically, move into actually a very clear public demonstration that is now a serious part of our roadmap for not just for the future, but for now. I think there is always a combination of things that needs to happen, right? I think there is basically 3 different points. I think you have to have visionary leadership, and without that, nothing will happen. And you can have the best ideas in the world, you can see the world with a great interest and actually very sure about what's going to happen. But again, if you don't have really senior leadership that believes in it, it will never happen. So second, you also need to have actually effective transformation people. So people that will look at the same thing with a different pair of eyes, right? Again, this is not magic, or is not being mandrake and trying to elaborate a different view. I think if you really look at sports with a different pair of eyes, and you understand, as I said in the beginning, different models from different organizations, you can probably understand or have a much better assessment of what is happening. And I think, in my personal case, of course, I have a massive experience in football, which is interesting, because it also helps me understand better than probably many other organizations what are the problems. And so there is a mix of things, right? But I think in a point there is today also, and the third point is a very important one, which is there is a threat, right? There is a threat, and the threat, again, is not an Armageddon, but is actually a threat that football as we know it, which has been basically the leading sport in the world, probably the biggest community in the world, even if we still don't know exactly what is the size of that community. But the problem that we have today is how can we still make sure that football, as we know it, will still be relevant in 4 or 5 years from now? Because we live in a global world. We live also in a massive power shift, right? I always say that rights holders like FIFA, and many others used to be part of the Holy Trinity, so of this business, right? Which basically between us, broadcasters, and commercial partners, we use actually to manage a business model that has been actually successful for the entire industry for probably 20, 25 years. And today, I think that in front of us is something is happening, a big power shift, that actually this Holy Trinity has a totally new first 11, let's call it this way. But there is now today a migration of power to data companies. There is a migration of power actually to fans and athletes, because fans today have a way to demonstrate actually their ownership, which before was probably not as evident or not as easy, and investors, right? Because again, at the end of the day, you see what is happening in many sports. It used to be an industry that was seen as highly risky and nobody wanted actually to invest. So today we have actually starting to have some success stories of really strong investment companies that are coming to sports to actually try to elevate it to the next level. And I think that's for me personally, is a very important point. So I think any modern rights holder need to understand where this is moving and need to as well make sure that it will still play a role, in this new ecosystem.
So when Jenna and I were talking earlier on, I was laying out a potential nightmare scenario, at least in my mind, that the next time there's a round of Olympic rights, Amazon buys a bunch, and then and they stream it, and it's fine. And then the time after that, they stream it, but they say, well, these sports, nobody really watches that, so we're probably not going to stream those ones so much, or there'll be less of it. And then suddenly after that, you're in a place where sports are just not getting exposure, and then they don't get funding, and then they start to right. That's the nightmare scenario. Having painted a nightmare scenario, you've just come into the IOC, which has such, again, a very broad supportive remit. So what is the opportunity if you can make all that digital transformation work?
I mean, I think Luis and I have similar ambitions in the sense that relevance is paramount. We're in an increasingly distributed and fractured world where the amount of content that comes across our eyes and our minds and demands our attention is profound. And we're lucky if we get as sport organizations, as brands, as moments in time, in the case of things like World Cup and Olympics, we get 3 seconds to make you love us. That is hard. So I think, yes, the doomsday you just painted is scary, is real for anyone who works in the models that we do. And I think it's figuring out how do you look at the richness that you do have across your ecosystem, which is beyond your house. It's not just what sits within you. It is truly the ecosystem that consumers have deemed valuable, that they have told us they want to invest in and that they're going to participate in. And figuring out a way to keep the value that you've built that is important. I think we both have models that are incredibly important to how we operate and exist and are able to do what we do without neglecting the opportunity that sits ahead of us in a chance to avoid that doomsday. What does that look like? I don't know. I don't think anybody at this point can confidently say, this is it. There are models being tested. You see, clubs and federations going in and starting to stream on Amazon and Google and Facebook, and they're going to try the models. And I think that's when you start to think about digital transformation, one of the things that you sort of have to have as a guiding principle is that if you're unwilling to fail, you're unwilling to succeed. And so those models may be amazing, and they will prove out to be extraordinarily successful, and we'll all follow in suit. Or they may not, and we'll learn something from them, and we'll build new models. It doesn't start and stop with one decision. It is an inevitable transformation that you continue on sort of in perpetuity, which is a bit daunting, but in perpetuity.
Do you think that the use of the word fail, generally speaking, people in sport like winning, right?
Yes.
And failing is not generally a good way of persuading the chairman that he really ought to spend some money on a thing.
Yes.
Because fail fast, fail better has been a digital mantra for
Absolutely.
forever. But
Forever.
There's different ways internally, I guess, to persuade that. Now, one of those is that return on investment angle, actually. And Pedro, when you go and talk to federations, one of the reasons I think, as I understand it, your service, gets the take-up is because you're saying, we'll give you the data and we'll give you revenue, right?
100%, and I think that's where we play a big difference against the big data companies that have pushed as well for this transformation. So they played an important role as well. But what I think is important now is for the sports community, in my space, football, to understand that what they own is much more than just content, right? The power of the network that they collectively own is massive. And maybe these contents, long-tail contents individually, they might not have power, but once they start thinking collectively and aggregating this community into one single space, and then there's a lot of talks about other types of content as well. We as an industry need to start thinking that the 90 minutes are not just enough, that we need to start driving content in several different ways to address different types of audiences, such as young kids or older people or people that like different types of contents that don't include the game itself. There's a really huge potential to build something that can compete against these big data businesses. And I really think that if you put all together, not even speaking about the fans, if you speak about football and the number of players that are estimated to be registered in football federations across the world, which range between 400 to 500 million, or maybe I'm exaggerating now a little bit, protecting a bit my business, but there's a huge potential. When you look at Netflix, that has 130 million subscribers and are doing 15 billion or more a year just in subscriptions. So I think if the industry finally comes together and works in a democratic environment, distributing content collectively, not only thinking about premium, but putting everything together into one single community, then there's massive potential out there.
Can I do a quick add? So I think there's something interesting that you've hit on that I've found as I've worked across different organizations, whether they're corporations or platform side, trying to instigate change for data management and how people think about it. One of the things that I find fascinating is that we constrain ourselves to the boxes that we know. We have put ourselves in this, we've defined who we are and what we will be forevermore, and then we innovate in that. And you look at, anyone who's, I think, ever done a management course or a leadership course, one of the things that they teach you is you're lucky if you know 10% of what potential is. There's a whole 90% that sits outside your box that you don't even realize is a possibility. And I think what you're touching on is a really important one as you think about driving digital transformation in your organization, is don't get stuck in the 10%. It is very easy to stay in your box and define innovation and transformation within that 10%. It's the 90% that's going to move the needle. And it's being fearless enough to sort of go into that 90% and say, I may or may not come out with pieces of my box intact, maybe, or I may altogether throw my box away. I don't know. But being willing to step into that is a really important part of that transformation.
If I can add just a small item, then I give the space to the others, is many of the organizations working with us, the federations, they organize Premier Leagues. And they're thinking of creating their own OTT directly to the consumer. And then we ask, but do you want a community? Do you know who your users are? How are you going to drive this community to consume your content? And then they all say, oh, we have this community on Facebook, or we have this community on Instagram, but do you really own it? How much it costs you to reach it? Can you make it a sustainable business model? And then they start making the accounts, and definitely not. And they own the potential to build this community by working with all these contents that nowadays are worth nothing. And technology here plays a massive transformation role because it lowers the cost of production, it scales, and then by bringing this content on board and bringing this new community that before was not there, then these organizations can really drive powerful transformation individually.
So we've got a scenario in which the technology and the digital transformation is coming, like whether you like it or not. I mean, as you said, we've been talking about it for 10 years, right? But it's in process. If I was betting, I'd say you've got, thinking about how long news and music took to adjust, we've got at least another 10, maybe 20 years worth of this kind of flow to go through, if it ever settles down, because the pace of change seems to be increasing. You've got data becomes super important, the technology is super important, but that's not what's going to make the difference because the user behaviors are very powerful. You need to have fear of failure, right? No fear of failure, rather, because you've got to be able to do it. You've got to accept that change is constant, and you've got to be okay with not knowing a bunch of stuff, right? You are painting a scary scenario for most CEOs or bosses. So there has to be a return on investment other side of it. Right?
Yeah, and I think what Jenna was talking about in terms of innovating outside the 10%, innovating in the 9%, there's a lot. I mean, it means there's a lot of stuff. I mean, all of our roles are incredibly broad. So, we're dealing with product, content, data, customer experience, CRM, a bunch of other stuff. Obviously, third-party products that are outside of our control, and then you start to look at emerging platforms. You look at augmented reality, virtual reality. You look at AI, machine learning, how that applies. I think I think it is scary from the top looking down to make sure that you've got the right people, the right team leading that. But I think what you've got to do in terms of that 90% is like embrace that 90%, but focus on the aspects that are really key to your business priorities, because digital transformation will be different for every organization, depends on where you are in the journey. But you've got to basically set it up right. It's not a technology change. It is tech, it's very technical, but it's largely a business change. And I think that's why I think you've really got to sort of focus on, in our areas, I think we've got to focus on where the big wins are. They will be in revenue, ultimately. But sometimes you need to sort of invest and choose those, place your bets on the big things that you think are going to change.
But also I'll add 3 points that I think are different or additional to this. I think far and foremost, of course, you need also to look at this as a massive cultural change, right? And I think if you look at sports industry as a whole, there is one point we've never been very good at, which is actually being cross-functional, right? So we always fight a lot on the pitch, and we fight off the pitch. I think there is a project that we've been involved 10 years ago, so actually some of the people that are on this table, a certain club in the northern England, which actually proved we could do actually something totally cross-functional at the football level, right? And this was just a little seed, okay, that was left there and keep growing. And also I think has been contributing to influence some other people in the industry to do the same. I think far and foremost, you need to change your culture inside, because, of course, and this is normal to big corporations as well, you tend to have in every organization a massive vertical culture, right, where there is absolutely zero interaction and zero exchange of valuable information. But also you need to change as well the spectrum of what happens externally. For instance, if you look today at this number of speakers, you see very different organizations. And we're all talking about the same thing, right? And we're talking very openly about it. So actually it can be done, right? And if one day actually everyone can actually work together, then no one can stop really the sports industry to go to is really, you know, maximum effect. And then another point, I think, and this is also something that, for instance, me and you have been discussing for many years, I think also it's about time that someone can once and for all prove that revenue and new forms of revenue are actually part of digital and effectively of digital transformation. I think we've all been trying for many years to see where is the Holy Grail, right? So where can we find really this digital landscape that will just keep us very lazy and just bring us, you know, the big checks coming, right? And we always assume that one day there will be a direct migration from the social securitization from media broadcasters to actually the new world of digital media. And it might be that this happen or not, but it's not just, let's say, an automatic process, right? So I think today, if you look really at this holistically, and you look at technology, you're looking at data, you're looking at content, you're looking at multiple different layers, you actually can create a business out of that, right? Which doesn't interfere with the traditional revenue streams of the industry. Will not interfere still with traditional media rights, will not interfere with traditional sponsorship, because that's also an area that is under a massive change, and will not interfere with ticketing and hospitality, right? But probably will interfere also with something that is a growing business and also is a massive game changer for the sports industry, which is, of course, the advent of virtual sports. And how we also going to manage to find convergence in that will be fundamentally important, actually, for the two sides of the pond, right? So I think actually that's quite an exciting journey. And finally, I think the sports is mature enough now to have this journey, right? Which, again, time will tell who's right and wrong, but I think actually that's quite a very interesting outcome that we can all deliver.
David's loitering. Have we got time for one more question, or are we?
If it's quick.
All right.
I'm everyone's worst enemy today. I'm just
quick?
literally shutting up people every single time. If it can be really quick, Richard, I trust you with my life.
All right. It's
Go for it.
it's a simple one. The digital transformation journey, right? That sport, let's say sport wider than that sport is on. How far through? Give me a percentage. Like, are we in the very beginning? Are we halfway through? You know, just a rough finger in the air. Go.
Okay. I have to reply to that question in two ways, right?
Oh.
No, just
Only one way, please.
I'll say that we are probably now between 1% and 5%.
Okay.
Okay, but also I think it's important to understand that the full industry is probably, as I say, between 25 to 35% of its full potential.
Okay.
I was going to say sort of 15 to 25%, but depending on, you know, which way you look.
I'm right in the same camp. I was 10 to 15%. We're at the beginning, but we've got some good groundwork laid.
I have to say there's still a long way, but the mentality is changing. I would say like 5 to 10%,
Okay.
but things are moving forward fast, which is good.
So I'm going to give one last thing. It's always nice to be able to come away from listening to a conference panel with some tips. There were lots of tips in the stuff that these guys said. If I can add my one tip for you, it would be if you're going to get your organization to adapt, make sure your lawyer and your commercial director are on board. Because if they're not on board, it's never going to happen, right? But other than that, thank you so much to an excellent panel, and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Richard, Luis Vicente, Rusell, Stopford, Jenna, Pelkey, and also Pedro, Presa. Thank you very much indeed, guys. Please to depart the stage.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed, Pedro. Jenna, thank you very much indeed. Guys, I'm so sorry to cut you short, but, you know, excellent stuff. Lots of content in there. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Richard, as always.